Hey everyone, welcome to the Charging Up Leadership podcast. Today I have a very special guest. John Abele, co-founder of Boston Scientific Corporation, is on the program. I am so excited to hear his perspective. And I'll say, as I was doing my research, I was more and more impressed seeing his leadership theories, his penchant for collaboration and innovation. I originally wanted to talk to him about vision, and there's just so much more. He's a really wonderful person, and I even wore my Boston Scientific ring today. It's probably the only time I've worn it, just in celebration. So stay tuned. You are not going to want to miss this conversation. Here we go. This is the Charging Up Leadership Podcast, and I am your host, Heidi Fry. This podcast is all about energizing you from the inside out, inspiring you to plug in, light up, and just be the best version of yourself in how you live and lead. So can you repeat what you just said? How we were the bridge between a lot of departments?
Yeah, the point is when Boston Scientific was started, the product we started with was a steerable catheter. And the steerable catheter was basically able to get into parts of the body, many different parts of the body, that others weren't. Now, it changed over time, but it was for diagnostic purposes. And I remember saying at one point, well, gee, while we're there, why don't we fix it? And we were basically helping the surgeon understand what he was going to do by injecting contrast or taking samples or preparing the site where the surgeon was going to open up. And I said, well, we can short circuit all of that. and the surgeons, were sort of offended by that. And by being able to put our catheters into the kidney, the stomach, the arteries, the veins, the brain. We were in lots of different areas that were different specialties. And those specialties kind of owned that part of the anatomy. And they were not sharing a lot with the other specialties. And it was sort of interesting to us because we were supplying the tools that we made to go with our steerable catheter. Once you could get a tube into part of the body, the key was to have a channel that you can put other tools through, easy in and out and back and forth, biopsy, sampling, removing, whatever it might be. And others thought that that was a mistake. We should have focused just on one specialty. Well, it turns out whenever we developed a tool for one specialty, then we had the potential for the other specialties to use it. Right. So we didn't just get one output from the R&D we put in it. We got multiple outputs, and each specialty thought they had invented it. That was the lack of coordination they had. I remember one time visiting, I think was a cardiologist, and he said, could you make a device that looked like this? And he showed me this thing and so forth. And I said, look, come down the hall. And I took him to the urology suite. And I said, look at this up on the wall where those things were hanging. And he said, oh, my God, that's it. Well, the naivete that they have about how things get developed and what you can do and what you can't do and so forth was, for us, an asset. Sure. And therefore, we were able to do more with fewer development dollars because we got multiple markets out of it. And of course, at that time, this is back to the 70s and even a little bit of the 60s, international markets, things took place very differently there. And by and large, we in the United States didn't see that. It just a few doctors would see it, but not broadly. That's changed more, but even now there is a naivete about what is done in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
There was a very famous doctor named Barry Marshall who was in Perth, Australia. He was a gastroenterologist.
Okay.
And he sort of made a rather interesting discovery about the source of ulcers was not acid. It was a bug.
Mm.
And uh, the he presented or he wrote a paper and tried to present it to the DDW, which was our big GI
Right.
collection meetings each year, and was turned down. They wouldn't accept it. 25 years later, believe it or not, 25 years later, he got the Nobel Prize. And when you think about it, that's what innovation really is.
Right.
Innovation is new ideas that other people don't understand or don't think will work, or so forth. So a lot of the problem is not the invention. It's
Mm-hmm.
how do you get people to use it? And this is something that we ended up doing pretty well at.
Well,
Uh,
I remember reading in one of an article that was written on you that way back when you were working at, I think, the light technology, and there was a engineer that couldn't get a great idea through the system, and you led the way and helped him get recognized. And so, to your point, sometimes it isn't the technology, it's how accepted it is, right?
yeah, well, it's how we communicate, it's how we collaborate.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we did actually initially, I think it was in the GI area, we had a doctor in England, not a doctor in England, actually a business person in England who was selling our product. And he held a meeting for the technicians involved with the GI work.
Mm-hmm.
And we worked with him, and we actually had a competition between a radiologist and a gastroenterologist
Mm.
on the removal of retained stones in the gallbladder. And it was interesting because with the gastroenterologist, he used an endoscope.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, Olympus had made for him a special mini scope that went inside the big scope.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't commercial or anything, but it was new and
Sure.
it was dramatic. And we had, I think, 6 patients,
Mm.
and each one did 3. They alternated, and the moderator was the other doctor. So to keep them honest, we alternated. So they would have
Uh-huh.
to be honest because they knew this position would be
Sure.
reversed coming up. And it the people who attended said they learned more in that meeting than any of the regular educational meetings they had taken. That became sort of an early version of the live demonstration course.
Sure.
And is exactly what happened with Andreas Grunzig, the sort of one of the great fathers of angioplasty, but obviously a dramatic one. And he had done that in Switzerland
Hmm.
and had various diverse doctors. And that was driven by the improvements in video conferencing and video tools generally. And Siemens actually spent a lot of work trying to do, in essence, commercial video.
Oh, wow.
It's not their home run, but they do a lot of the research in that. But the point is, the doctor would operate in the lab and then in the same building, but in a different room,
Mm.
theater.
Mm.
People would be able to see everything in the procedure, and
Mm-hmm.
the doctor would be able to see them
Mm.
when
Mm.
they were asking questions. And so it sounds, in a way, sort of crazy, but it was a more technical version of what had been going on for a century, where a lot of people gather in the operating suite.
Sure.
It would be bending their head to try
Mm.
to see what
Mm-hmm.
was going on. And suddenly now you have a tool that can let everybody see the close up.
Right. Right.
And then we added to that the concept of what you have with sports, with slow motion and ability to draw on the screen and point out where things were, so forth. So we just borrowed from the world of sport, and it was just common sense to do.
Yeah.
But the medical field was constrained by this pseudo professional. That's the bad professional. It becomes check the box.
Yes. Yes.
Thinking of behavior,
Mm-hmm.
and that we changed that. And this was a royal we. It was the early adopter doctors who were interested in trying out new things,
Mm-hmm.
partly because of curiosity on their own part, and partly because they wanted to be known by their colleagues. They wanted to become famous, if you will, rich and famous. That was kind of the goal, and have a lot of power. And therefore, they became the type of doctor we'd like to know.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is the doctor inventors, and there's infinite number of them, a lot of them were so focused on themselves that they weren't credible to others. And, they were, excuse me, they were bullshitters and brilliant inventors, but you couldn't trust them. They would say, I've never had a problem. Well, sorry, I doubt that.
Yeah.
You have had problems and you're just denying them. And so that became an alternative way in which we reached doctors. It was the live demonstration course, which was in essence independent of the establishment. The establishment being the medical school, the professional society, and the government. And it was private. It was in a hospital. Sometimes people from those professional societies or the medical schools would be there, but they didn't control what was going to go on. We developed a methodology, again, the royal we, the methodology that meant you in the audience were going to see new cases. And frequently, because this was about the time that satellite image communication was coming in the 70s.
Right.
And therefore, we did it outside the United States, so the FDA couldn't say anything. And the surgeons were upset by this and said, that's immoral and unethical and the normal sort of stuff.
Sure.
We're sort of getting that today, every day in politics. Anyway, that happened. But in fact, the people who came to our independent meetings on these topics said that I'm uncomfortable with some of that because there are companies involved. But in fact, I trust what I'm hearing here more than in my professional society, or subtle on how they cheat. And peer review, is the standard, but in fact, it's also vulnerable to abuse. And the establishment doesn't want too much new stuff because that's a threat and a risk to them for their power. So they will say they like good stuff, but they want to see it, go through a process of 20 years of trial, which makes it economically impossible to get there.
Right.
And so that was sort of the world that we lived in. And then this live demonstration course evolved from the GI to the vascular, radiology and cardiology. Cardiology was the most aggressive with it. And then it went around the world. And you think of that happening in the different cultures, and the different senses of humor, and the different senses of what's right and wrong, the hierarchical behavior in other countries, particularly in the Orient, whether it's the Koreans or the Chinese or the Japanese. You tend to look at them from a distance, say, well, Oriental and so forth, but they are very, very different
Yeah.
from each other. And that live demonstration course, which was very American because it was very open.
Sure.
It's a very, very famous case when Andreas Grunzig was lured to the United States from Switzerland.
Right.
A lot of places bid for him, Cleveland, San Francisco, and so forth. But he ended up at Emory in Atlanta. And they were doing one of the live demonstration cases. And not surprisingly, there was a complication.
Mm.
And the host said, we're going to shut off the camera for a while and spend some time and we'll try to fix it. And we'll come back and tell you what happened. And the audience stood up and said, no, we are here because we want to see what goes on how you handle this complication. So you got to have the guts to be able to do it, the guts to show how you think, because that's what we want to hear. And in addition to, having that happen, and in some cases, by the way, the physical audience would be 5,000 people watching.
Oh my gosh.
With everybody having a clicker. This is before Twitter and the phones and all of that. But basically, later on, people would use Twitter or the equivalent.
Oh my gosh. I was picturing like 50 to 100 people.
No. It was huge. Wow. And a lot of people would go, not because they wanted to do this new technique, but that they have patients that they couldn't treat. And they wanted to find out if this would be an option.
Of course.
And they would see the future in ways that the professional society wouldn't touch. It was too early for them.
Of course. So, John, like we're just talking, we haven't even really started, and there's just so much rich juiciness in all the things that you're saying. And so I just want to, I guess, informally now, welcome you to the podcast. And, you're known for being a pioneer and a leader in less invasive surgery. Of course, you're the co-founder of Boston Scientific. You are still doing work with children literacy and science. You are just a go, go, go sort of guy. And I'm especially appreciative, as I've dug into some research about you, your commitment to innovation and collaboration and leadership skills and leadership theory. And it's just been really an honor to research you, let alone talk to you live. So thank you so much for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, it's really a treat. All right, so back to our conversation. Okay, can we circle back around to, I would love to know the spark, like, do you remember the moment when you said, like what you were just saying earlier about, why can't we go through this catheter? What was the spark of the moment where you said, we can do Boston Scientific, or we can revolutionize less invasive surgery? What was it? Was there a moment?
I think there were a lot of those types of moments. The aha. I mean, the one I've already told you about, which is both with endoscopes and then with catheters. The idea is we were there to do diagnostic work.
Yeah.
But we said, well, gee, while you're there, I think we can fix it as well. Why don't we try? And Charles' daughter, in a way, the doctor who was probably most known for starting people to think this way. There was an article in Life magazine in 1964, which showed him treating a leg of a patient who also happened to be a doctor.
Right.
Non-invasively, but with a catheter. And he just basically had a tapered catheter, and there was a narrowing, and he pushed the tapered catheter through the narrowing, and it opened it up, and surprise, he got instant feedback.
The first dilatation, right?
Yeah. And in medicine, instant feedback is a huge deal. Those types of procedures
Mhm.
will be passed on because patients will tell others about them.
Right, right. Well, and you're also known for being a silo crusher, I think is the term I saw, where you are really great about bringing together the different technologies, as you said earlier, the different departments, using technology in one area and then using it in another. And so you just don't see one path. That is not how your brain works.
Well, I think to me, innovation or invention
Mm-hmm.
is frequently metaphor.
Mm.
It's you see something in one area and you say, well, that might apply to another area.
Mm-hmm.
You think of those as a way to solve problems constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And in medicine, um, are you familiar with the whole IDEO story and design thinking?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Design thinking came out of Stanford, more specifically David Kelly. Actually,
Yeah.
they were the Kelly brothers, but David Kelly
Mm.
actually started a design course at Stanford.
Right.
But with this design course, he didn't charge any money for the students, and the people who taught it didn't get paid.
Mm.
And you say, well,
Mm.
why would he do that? You don't understand. That was genius. It meant that Stanford as an institution couldn't tell him what to do, that he had to do it
Mm.
or not, because he was independent of the financial implications.
Right. Right.
But the professors loved it because, first of all, they liked the idea of talking about it. And the design thinking basically is rather than focusing on theory, you just watch what people do.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people focus on let's ask everybody what they
Yeah.
do and why
Yeah.
they don't do something. Well, you still want to do that, but that is nowhere near as good as watching them
Mm-hmm.
and seeing how they do it, what they do in between, and watching carefully. And that's where IDEO, the design thinking
Yeah.
firm, came
Mm-hmm.
from.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been passed through, business schools throughout the world.
Right. Right.
And it's that kind of approach that we didn't call it design thinking, which said this the way we like to
It
approach
was
it.
so fancy.
And well, sometimes naming things is a good idea.
Yeah.
We were sort of doing it before it was named. And there were a lot of other sort of practices that we did that I think were more in the common sense area, and they weren't in the business school Bible,
Mm-hmm.
thinking of it in those terms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a lot of our course comes down to relationships
Yeah.
and making sure you understand all the players in a particular topic.
Mm-hmm.
And they may be players who are in another field, but they're doing something very similar to what you're doing. And maybe they'll have insights. For example, the vena cava filter that we made was really based on an idea from an oilfield engineer.
Right.
And you put a taper in it, and that will hold the thrombus that it catches in the center of
Mm-hmm.
the blood vessel,
Mm-hmm.
so it'll get lysed much faster.
Right.
So
Right.
anyway, it's those sorts of thinking that is a way of doing real innovation. It's for example, is a company called Shockwave. Do you know
Right. Yep.
that company?
Isn't
Well,
that Doug Gottschall's company?
it is Doug
Yeah.
Gottschall,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he sold it to J&J for
Yeah.
14 billion or 13 billion, and ironically just bought a house next door here.
Oh, shout
And
out to Doug. Congrats on that one.
yes, but the point was, that's something that I tried with a doctor back in the 1970s.
Wow.
And because he had a lithotripter,
Mm-hmm.
and said, let's see if we can put this into a balloon. and break up some of the calcium. And we didn't do anything further. But what Doug and actually Doug wasn't the inventor; he was a
Sure.
CEO, but they did a lot of really good work in working out the details of that, publishing lots of different papers, and so you want to understand how does it go wrong. You want to understand all these things before you go to the full market, so to speak.
Sure.
Of course, in the medical market, the full market it's doctors, and there are some irresponsible doctors, of course. There's always going to be in any field.
Yeah.
But you try to make sure that you get as many people to purposely use it wrong so you can reduce the likelihood of that ever happening.
Right. There's so many paths here with you, John. It's just you're one interesting guy, that is for sure. A little birdie told me that back in the day when you were Meditech, you were manning the booths. You were talking to the doctors. You were with Meditech. You had owned Meditech at the time, and creating a lot of a feedback loop, I suppose, with the products. I don't know if you know Pam, or if you remember Pam Jardee.
Yeah, very well.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So she was the one, she said three things. She said, one, talk about the Meditech booth and how John was standing there selling next to everybody else and, talking to the doctor. So that was a fun memory that she shared. The second one was the steerable catheter, which you've addressed already. And then the third one, she said, Heidi, definitely get him to talk about the ship in the bottle / ship in the balloon. She said it's a great story and one he loves so much. Would you give us the story?
I'll start with a ship in the balloon.
Okay.
And basically when Charles' daughter was talking to others about the whole concept of less invasive medicine and doing things with a catheter, the metaphor was the ship in the bottle.
Yeah.
How do you work through small holes to produce complex changes inside that space? And so that was the metaphor. So I sent him a ship in a balloon, and the ship was actually made by a guy who was about 90 years old on Cape Cod, who was a ship model maker. And I explained I wanted a model of the spray. The spray is the name of the ship that was sailed around the world alone. The first one ever to have that happen.
Wow.
In 1895.
Wow.
And, the likelihood of making it, you'd think, would be very low. There are a lot of books about that story, by the way. The irony is, even though he was sailing alone, he was helped by so many people along the way that it was a team that did it. Except they were located all the way around the world.
Yeah.
As he would stop and fix things or have a disaster and get help. And that, to me, was a bit of the metaphor of what we were doing.
Yes.
We're both alone, but we're also collaborating with people all over. And my view is that as you enlarge that circle, you get people thinking more broadly. And in the academic world today, you tend to be rewarded for knowing certain things at a very high level. That's great. But if you share them with others, then within that group, you're looked upon as perhaps a traitor. You shouldn't share with others. And it's a system that has certainly produced some great successes, but it also creates a lot of problems.
Sure.
And in the innovation world, you get real innovation when you crash those silos. And you begin to learn the different languages that you have to learn to understand these new fields and see how they inform each other.
Right.
And that to me is fascinating. The whole thing of curiosity. I
Hmm.
I majored in physics and philosophy when I was in
Yes.
college. I wasn't a great student, but I was more interested in the history of science
Hmm.
rather than the science itself. I mean,
Hmm.
I was interested in science, but I wanted to know, how did people do it? How did Madame Curie, you know, make that observation about the X-ray, and how did she go to the next steps, and how did she work with Pierre? That was, to me, that was the
Hmm.
perfect couple, so to speak.
Hmm. Hmm.
Scientists who were in great love with each other
Yeah. Yeah.
and doing wonderful things, and uh, that that mindset was a little bit different than you normally find.
Right.
And it turns out it's an asset to have that mindset. So I spent a lot of my time in my early years, even before Boston Scientific or before Meditech. Uh, I was working in some very interesting new technology. It was laboratory technology that didn't
Right.
about, but if you don't know much about, that's an asset. You
Yeah.
spend time and you learn it.
Yeah.
You learn it and you're motivated to learn it in order to accomplish the goal. Therefore, you tend to remember it better and you learn faster.
Hmm.
So that's a great mindset on the learning metaphor.
Well, it's learning theory for sure. And going back to the ship, what a fantastic symbol and metaphor, of course, of the company that I enjoyed so much as well. So I would say those that really resonated throughout the corporation while I was there, and I know it's gone beyond. So you did
Well,
well.
yeah, it's a fun story, and I think it's a lesson. Talk about leadership. I think it's it's a lesson that says there are a lot of ways to get to a goal,
Hmm.
and the best way to get there is one that works best for you
Yeah.
and one that works best for the situation, and you sort of work that out and you learn about that. And it's a little bit, when you learn a second language,
Hmm.
you learn more about your first language, and
Hmm.
then you learn a third language and you begin to learn the language of language,
Yeah.
and you realize, wow, there's a lot of things that it's very hard to talk about, so
Hmm.
let's invent new ways to talk about them. And that's what goes on all the time. To me, you think of all the new words that come into the language, and it's a little bit like new songs that are usually based on other songs,
Yeah. Yeah.
but modified and
Sure.
hacking into them. That's great, even though we have copyright and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
We get upset about that, but that, to me, with invention, that's what the real opportunity to
Right.
great advances, and do it at a cost level where there's margin to have a profit, and it really helps people.
You just mentioned a couple minutes ago about your degrees being in physics and philosophy, basically. And when I saw that, I thought, that makes sense because I didn't see you often, but when I saw you, you always had a smile on your face, a twinkle in your eye, and light coming from you. You always had light coming from you, and you were just shining and beaming. It's really such a great quality you have, and it made so much more sense when I saw those degrees because I'm like, oh, he has the science background, the inquisitive mind, curiosity, right? And then there's this other side, which is to quote you, I like to know how people tick. And I say, I like to know how people tick and how they're ticked off, right? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we have that in common for sure. Yeah.
I think we all do up to a point, but I
Mm.
think there are lots of different ways to try to understand why people behave the way they do. And I'm
Mhm.
fascinated by particularly some of the new investigations into that. The whole concept of behavioral economics,
Yeah.
which is, there were two Nobel Prizes literally in over 10 years
Mm.
recently, that for understanding why we behave in silly ways sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
because of hidden bias.
Yeah.
And we don't, it's hidden. That means we don't know it's there. And if
Mm-hmm.
you ever listen to Hidden Brain,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a wonderful example of sometimes barriers to your own goals that are you, and you've got to figure out different ways to think about it
Yeah.
so it doesn't become a barrier.
Yes. Well, and just as a side note, in the work that I do with clients, I often talk about like a backpack of their barriers, right? That prevent them from seeing things. So that's a lot of the work, is removing those barriers so we can be the
Sure.
best version of ourselves and the most authentic. So I think because of your degrees, that, right, left brain perspective, you've had an early run at breaking down some of those barriers, seeing what other people aren't seeing, and back to that idea of silo crushing and innovation. There's so much that you've talked about regarding bringing together, it's not disparate people, but bringing people with various viewpoints and moderating them so that they almost challenge each other. And actually, my favorite story that I read about you was how you I don't recall the exact situation, but basically there were a group of people and they spent a lot of time together, and because of that they had so much fun together. They were, committed to their friendships, and all of a sudden they were sharing technology. That is the culture that you created at BSC. It's like, I was laughing as I read it. I was like, oh, I understand that. That's exactly what you did. Was you intentional about that?
Uh, yeah, I think we were. I was an early advocate of the power of culture before the books came out,
Mhm.
but I think so were a lot of others,
Mhm.
and they just weren't talking about it as much. But to me, culture is everything, and it's the culture we've lost in our country in recent years. So we're not helping each other out as much as we used to.
Mhm.
And in a business, uh, that's what entrepreneurship is all about.
Mhm.
And it's not just entrepreneurship for business; it's entrepreneurship for solving problems, which
Mhm.
means you've got to look wide,
Mhm.
and you've got to understand what are the different ways that we can define this problem. What if we were to make things worse? How would we go about doing it?
Mm.
Because that gives you an understanding of where the vulnerable points are.
Yeah. Mm.
And when you're doing an invention, that's another
Right.
another trick of, what are the other ways to do it? How it would fail? Can we make it fail if it
Mhm.
seems to be?
Mhm. Mhm.
That all of that sort of stuff. And that to me, that and enthusiasm about what you're doing
Mhm.
is really sort of critical in any organization. And trying to uh, create mechanisms so people want to solve the problems themselves. I
Mm.
think it was in the 80s that, and when it was very hard to hire new people because the unemployment was way down.
Mhm.
And so we had a lot of international people,
Okay.
and we would bring them together times to everybody would cook their own foods from wherever they came from, have a lot of fun that way. But we would learn in that process that we thought, initially being really naive, well, the Vietnamese, they'll all get along together because they've got this thing. So no, we hadn't been paying attention to things that was on the news every day. That there are Montagnards and the mountain people and the river people, and the mountain people and the river people do not get along well together. It's like, sometimes rivalries in your own family are worse than rivalries, outside your family.
Sure.
And recognizing that, hey, there are ways to get around. Look for the common values,
Mm.
and see what you can do. And that you can find that at almost any level
Mm-hmm.
of recognizing why we're doing what we're doing, and that frequently it'll take a while. So we're going to go through these doors. And sometimes going after the biggest market first is the dumbest thing to do.
For
It may
sure.
the most
For sure.
logical thing from the venture capitalist view, because if you're going to raise money, you want to talk about the biggest market that'll happen the fastest.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do that and you make a mistake, the market will be quite unforgiving. They don't trust you because you haven't earned it.
Right.
And, so you'll be thrown out. And not only that, in the process, you will poison the well, meaning it will be much more difficult
Mm-hmm.
to solve that problem going forward, because everybody has that bad memory of, well, that's been tried and it didn't work.
Right. Right.
But the reason it didn't work is not that it was bad. It was that the people doing it were bad.
Or still working out the kinks. That really is the foundation of territory management philosophy. You don't go to your biggest client when you're a newbie. You go practice on some of the smaller ones,
Exactly.
smaller hospitals, right? And then
Yeah. And
then you go to the
they
big ones.
love you because they're
Yes.
getting the attention. So,
Right. Exactly. So a similar theory for sure. I remember seeing something about, well, and you already mentioned it earlier about pseudo leaders. I call those false leaders or ego driven. They're
right.
drawing from a power outside of themselves versus within, right?
Yes.
And you talk a lot about that. Would you expound on that theory, or how did that develop? Is that something that came from your childhood? Is that something that you saw in someone else that you wanted to emulate? But where did that come from, John? Because those are some really lofty principles that you passed on to all of us.
Uh, it was passed on to me. I mean, I spent a lot of time uh, working for a company that was great for me. I ended up managing the company,
Mm,
but for a family owner.
mm,
And it was pretty clear that the future there was going to be family, not me.
hmm
And I wanted to do something that I could have a bigger role in.
mm.
But I also knew I didn't have the knowledge or experience. So I'm actually quite risk averse, although I'm weird in that because I've taken some very big risks over
Mhm.
the years. But I always used to carry a Swiss Army knife, and that suggests that I always want to be prepared. So,
Right?
and that's the mindset of people who do that. But you don't usually expect leaders to be doing that. That's a thing that a techie or an engineer might do. I'm not an engineer either, by the way. I'm a tinkerer, but I'm not an engineer.
Yeah. Well,
And
wait, explain that a little bit to me. I don't understand the correlation of the Swiss Army knife.
the Swiss Army knife is a tool that can do a lot of things.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
it's like carrying with you a tool that can get you out of trouble. And therefore, I'm also a metaphor might be when I was skiing and I went up to the edge. I wanted to see where I was going,
hmm
whereas uh, the risk-taking skier would ski off straight into the air and figure it out when he's landing. And of course, I saw actually one time when he landed on a little kid and killed him. This was at Mad River Glen in Vermont. And,
Oh my
and
gosh.
so that had an interesting impact on me. But uh, it's, uh, I think, it's managing risk, I guess.
hmm
But it's also recognizing reluctance to do things until you're prepared. And that's a thing you're always balancing that. And some people balance it more than others. And there are some people who will rush ahead. They enjoy the psychology of the risk taking.
Mm-hmm.
And but as a result, part of my preparation on the management thing, can I do it? Overcome imposter syndrome. Is I talked with a zillion people, and I got jobs that allowed me to talk. Interviewing, one of the jobs was a consultant for a company that was developing education, education for multi-specialty technicians,
Okay.
like bioengineering or electromechanical, whatever it is. Anyway, that was fascinating because I traveled all over and I visited hundreds of companies in the medical field. And obviously, I wanted to find out what made them work.
Right.
The most important question I learned to ask is, how do you make decisions around here? Or how are decisions made? Which is the same thing, but not the same thing, because very frequently, some companies, the decisions are made because they are not made, meaning that by avoiding the issue, it will create a problem that will require a much more difficult decision to be made. And there are leaders who push down very well, where the number one job of the leader is to provide the resources, the environment where the people who work for that organization can be the most successful.
Right.
And a lot of that is very psychological and political. And convening becomes a real art in terms of bringing people together to make decisions that are functional and not spend your entire life in meetings. And it's so often organizations get trapped by the thing that helps them make decisions, but it becomes almost check the box thing. Yes, we had the meeting.
Right.
And then you have meetings about meetings and so forth.
So how would you advise someone eliminate that problem in their organization?
I think talking with lots of others is always great.
Yeah.
And bringing people together that you create the meeting. You can go to other people's meetings like yours.
Yeah.
And get some help. But it's even more powerful if you organize the meeting yourself. And that the skill set in doing that, in terms of having a relationship with people and understanding people. Just a silly story, but one that has a lot of meaning to it, is Derek Bach was the president of Harvard for a while. He was the president of Harvard twice.
Okay.
Because the person who followed him had a mental breakdown, which is very understandable for any president, particularly today.
Yeah.
And so they called him back, and he had to make a decision quickly. And so he called together the faculty senate, because, in universities, it's the faculty have to make those decisions. He said, we're going to run this meeting a little bit differently than you're familiar with. I'm going to go around and tell each of you what you were going to tell me with regard to the question that I've just presented to you.
Okay.
And people say, well, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And after I tell you that, I want you to tell me what I left out, what I was wrong at, or whatever. And you think, well, that's really arrogant and so forth. But in fact, it's the other way around. He had basically the respect and appreciation that he would risk being able to say to those people, this is what you are all about. And he does it in a respectful way. And it means that he has honored them by listening to them and remembering what it is about them that makes them unique.
So
And the
does
observation was, number one, they made a decision which was heretical that fast. And then it went well.
So does this point back to your Yoda leadership style?
Yeah, I don't know about the Yoda thing. I like that. That's a sort of a behind the scene influencer on decisions.
Mm.
You think about your own lives, where who are the Yodas that you might want to talk to if you have a problem? And they're there. Sometimes they're family, sometimes they're teachers, but other times they can be the person who sat next to you on that, international trip in the airport.
Yeah.
And I've had those, and it's a lot of fun because you'll say things that never go anywhere because you'll never see this person again.
Right.
And therefore you can be much more candid and fun in a way. But you think about the ability to be able to ask questions like that, where the job of the Yoda in that situation is to reframe what they have heard from you into words that will allow you to see different perspectives of what you're trying to think about.
It's funny that you'd use the word perspective, because I was just thinking about that applied to you. I don't think I think you appreciate this about yourself, but I don't think you realize how unique it is to have this, again, physics and philosophy background. So let's just call it hard and soft. And I find a lot of leaders poo-poo the soft because they're driving after these really hard, tangible numbers. And actually, it reminds me back of the BSC days when you were challenged with driving growth, driving innovation, and yet this culture, these relationships, it was just, I think, all of us have been trying to figure out what made it so special. And I think it does come down to those aspects of you.
In the early days at BSC, that market was much more like a pharmaceutical mindset for the salespeople.
Okay.
Where they treat the doctor like God. They're very obsequious and sucking up and all that sort of stuff. I would have thought that would be transparent, but it's not. It works. It's sad to say. Anyway, my view was, no, we're at equal level. We're just able to help them out in things that they can't. And yet we would hire people who were not primarily medically backgrounded. Because we always thought if a person was really good in sales, and I'm talking about the more sophisticated sales engineering, if you think about it that way. And understanding the real problems that the doctor has to go through, all of them, personal, professional, the works. And that's what BSC salespeople are famous for. And a lot of that, of course, was Dick Chenoweth was the god of that. Was he around when you were there?
Yes, he had fallen ill within months of my being there. Yes, he was a really great man.
You know the story.
And
the point is that everybody else was taking the pharmaceutical approach. And I said, my view is the stupidest thing in the world. We want to be viewed as we know, more about the things that you would like to know than anybody else. So the teaching and the education and the mindset relationship we wanted to have with our customers was, we won't abuse the privilege of knowing a lot of things about you. We will use that to help you, and we will connect you with something that BSC was good at. We had tons of toys,
Mm-hmm.
Cook also had tons of toys, but they took a more uh, obsequious approach.
Mm-hmm.
Or they hired a lot of medical technologists
Mm-hmm.
who are operating in that environment where you are, lower on the
Yeah.
pole,
Yeah.
shut up, all of that sort of stuff. And I said, no, we can't do that. We're not going to do the salesman surgeon thing,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which we were put in a season put in situations where a lot of times we were asked to actually do the procedure.
For
And
sure. Yeah.
and that, we're walking on thin ice there. And remember, they caught the guy, and that was in orthopedics,
Mm-hmm.
where the salesman was so damn good.
Yeah.
He was a magician, and so forth. But the point is, it's being at a level. I remember giving talks because
Mm-hmm.
always had to tell, and particularly with this earlier one,
Yeah.
I was teaching doctors, groups in an environment where, first of all, if I was talking at a medical school, I had to get written permission from the president of the medical school because I was from business,
Mm-hmm.
have the credentials.
Right.
But I absolutely was confident that, number one, I knew these guys because they were college classmates, and they all flunked physics. So yeah, I can help them on that. I will tell them, I will teach them my ninth grade physics that will help their lives forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of them came back to me. I
Mm-hmm.
remember telling people how to pour ketchup. Ketchup is a material that gets thinner, less viscous in shear, meaning if you stir it, it'll pour. But
Mm-hmm.
if you try to shake a full ketchup bottle, it won't do anything.
Mm.
You gotta take the top off, put the knife in there, spin it a few times, it'll pour fine. But by the way, it's a non-Newtonian fluid, and so is blood.
Mm-hmm.
Blood is like ketchup. It gets thinner in shear. And that's why we as a species are still here.
Mm.
Because when there's a narrowing in the vessel, the blood gets thinner to be able to keep going through it. So anyway,
Voila.
see what I'm saying? There's a bit of philosophy in that, and there's a
Yes.
physics in that, and
Yes.
chemistry in that. And
Yes.
so I always said, I remember I opened Barry Katzen's meeting for 20 years or longer, I guess. He had a live demonstration course meeting that became famous, still is famous.
Mm-hmm.
And I would always tell something that I knew the audience didn't know about. And they say, how can you do that? I say, it's easy. I look at things that they don't. and, and, and so I'm just passing on things that are interesting to me, but they're not things that he would, and I can talk about them in ways that they can sort of understand them.
Sure.
So that to me is creating that relationships where you have common goals. And I remember talking with the leaders of all these societies, and of course, creating a number of societies
Yeah.
with the doctors. What is it that will make the society work? They would do one thing where they would, shift presidents year to year because they want to give everybody a chance to be president of the society.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of, and they can put that in their,
Bio. Sure.
their bio, exactly. Anyway, it's sort of fun.
So you are still innovating. You're innovating in, with your foundation and with your first program. Would you like to speak a little bit about those and how they tie into who you are as a leader, an innovator, an inspirer and a problem solver, really?
It's interesting as I look, because I'm, 87 now. So all of us who are in that box, now I'm one of them. I believe and it's a bit surreal, by the way. Number one, that you mentioned,
Sure.
because I thought I would be gone a long time ago, and but understanding what you can do and what you can't do.
Mm.
You know, the Serenity Prayer. I'm a huge fan of Serenity Prayer,
Mhm.
and it's both what is doable and what you can do because of limitations. And
Right.
I have physical limitations. That meaning there's a lot of things I can't do,
Mhm.
but most of it's still up here. And
Razor sharp.
not at all. Memory goes away.
Okay.
So thank God for Google, and because I can figure things out, or Chat GPT. I can remember. Usually too late to be relevant, but nevertheless I can finish things. But the point is that I think if you've had those experiences, and the world today is very different than it was not that long ago,
Mhm, mhm.
and certainly a lot different from a lot longer ago. And therefore, what succeeded then wouldn't necessarily succeed now.
Mm.
But in fact, some of the principles, back to the culture of the BSC,
Mhm,
I think do. And Mike Mahoney, who's the leader today,
mhm,
is one of those rare people.
mhm.
And so we're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
We've got the same value that Medtronic does, and
Mhm.
Medtronic is a lot bigger. There's a
Yeah.
message, and that's culture.
Yeah.
And maintaining culture is the job of the leader.
Yes.
And so that's something that I believe very strongly at. And First Robotics has been a passion for a while, uh, because it is a method for teaching people who might be not bad technically, but usually pretty shy and introverted, so forth, to help them get out of that hole.
Mhm, mhm.
And the social and emotional learning in FIRST, which is a robotics competition,
Right.
it's more than a robotics competition. It has principles. Gracious professionalism is one of them. The whole idea of your enemy isn't your enemy. Your enemy is somebody you can learn from.
Yep.
And they are a competitor, but it's actually co-opetition, which is another sort of theme.
Mhm.
That this is true in nature and it's true in humanity, that everybody to a certain extent is a competitor and a collaborator. And you've got to know where the line is,
Mhm.
and you've got to understand where you can do things collectively
Mhm.
to produce better results. You have adversarial collaboration. I mean, this is why lawyers have to do versions of that. Though sometimes I wonder if they create more problems than not. And there is incentive sometimes to do that. But the point is that uh, the the ability to recognize how things get done, how are decisions made, uh, whether it's in a group of your team,
Yeah.
whether it's in a group of people who have never met each other, whether it's a group of people who are potential enemies, if not real enemies.
Mhm.
And how do you deal with that?
Mhm.
Statesmanship. That's the name that we apply towards dealing with that third category.
Sure.
And that to me is a job that successful companies today, uh, they have to learn those skill sets. You
Mhm.
are, in some ways, particularly if you're the size of a BSC today, you are a country. And, Facebook is bigger than any country in the world.
Mhm.
And what the hell is going on here? And what does that mean for
Mhm.
how society gets along together? Huge, real problem. So you as an organization have to learn to navigate those different attributes of what you're living in. the whole concept of influencers and how people can, make a gazillion on TikTok and yet get really pissed off if it gets, constrained or whatever it might be. These are fascinating things to me. And, maybe an example, sort of odd example, I've got 6 honorary degrees from various schools, but several are in science, but I've got one in law and I've got a PhD in humanities.
Oh
So,
my gosh.
so it's something that, I favor. That's the personality that I'd like to have. And I think great entrepreneurship, great leadership has to have elements of that, or they won't get there.
I love that. Yes, yes. I think a lot of people who are managers believe they're leaders, and without these other qualities that you've been talking about, they're just managers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
back
you have to earn
yes,
respect
yes,
and that trust.
yeah.
And that can be difficult, particularly when you have lose-lose situations. And particularly when you have laws that say you've got to respect the privacy of people, and yet some of that would be immoral to respect certain privacies. So you get
For sure.
huge,
Well,
huge
and a couple things that
problems.
you said to me, leaders don't follow a formula. Leaders are self-critical. They are open to best advice, opposed to the pseudo leaders who don't make mistakes because they kill the messenger and they hide the criticism, right?
Right.
Leaders have unshakable integrity. When in my notes, I put a box around that one because that is what I know to be true about the company you founded. Leaders take risks, even when they're risk averse, right? Leaders empower others. Leaders are proactive. Leaders respect the enemy and are respected in return. You've addressed that already. Leaders see challenges as opportunities, and leaders thrive on chaos, opposed to pseudo leaders who fear change. So those are just a couple of the leadership values that that you really are the core of who you are. They're the core of who you are. And those values are what we know and love about BSC for sure. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, really terrific. So your family foundation, is it pronounced Argosy?
It is.
It is. Okay. Is it your daughter that runs that foundation?
It is now, yes.
Okay. She's done some really great work. You've definitely passed on a beautiful legacy to the thing that really caught my attention was solving problems that no one else is really donating to or paying attention to. So people that are kind of projects that are kind of getting they're in the cracks, so to speak, and they're just doing really terrific work. So congratulations on that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. There's still all sorts of challenges, whether it's in business or politics or whatever. And I think one of the my goals is when leaders need to be educators. They need to talk about the problems that are lose-lose in nature. They should make sure that people who want to criticize can't criticize without saying, how would you do it?
Yes. Yes.
This is, and I think if government isn't doing that right now, politicians don't like to do that because that's asking work to be done by the voters. And there are some voters who respect that, but there are a lot who don't. And therefore, my mind, if we're to undo some of the basically the large political problems we have, that's going to come from business.
Yeah.
That's going to come from leaders of whatever organizations, but the ones who have to deal with those lose-lose situations.
Yeah.
And part of that comes from you've got to be an educator, an explainer. You've got to be a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
and all the things we know about what that takes. And, to me, words are everything. And I'm a real admirer
Mm-hmm.
of people who can help that. And even in the BSC world, the quotations of things, but both Pete and I used to say, and we never planned how to say it.
Mm.
When we said it, we ended up with the same message. But we were very different people.
Yeah.
And so that
Yeah.
made it much more powerful if the message was the same.
Speaking of which, you bring up Peter Nicholas.
Yes.
Um, how did you two, because you are so different, and yet I love that the values, you had the same from the same playbook, your
Yeah.
values. Did you like a marriage should be, did you go through and understand that about each other before you got married, or was it just a happy accident?
Uh, there was a lot of discussion between us that had nothing to do with uh, specific plans for
Mm-hmm.
us.
Mm-hmm.
It was just along the way after we talked for a while, and I was in a difficult position. Uh, he said, "Well, why don't, rather than sell your company, why don't we buy it?"
Mm-hmm.
And he was a risk taker that I was not,
Mm-hmm.
and he was a business guy that I was not.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we would both take each other's role
Mm-hmm.
periodically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have to say, as a rep at the earlier part of Boston Scientific, it was a really beautiful part of the culture to see the two of you attending our events and involved and engaged and talking to
We
us. And
both went to the booth and sold
yes,
products to doctors.
well, and I remember both of you being at my first meeting. It was in Faneuil Hall, and matter of fact, I came from Xerox, and I think it was Pete stood up there and he said, "Okay, who's the newest person?" I stood up and he said, I have a question for you. Let's see if you can get it right." And I'm shaking, and he said, "Which way do you put a stent? Uh-oh, uh-oh. Which way do you put a stent into a Xerox machine?" I was like, "Okay, gotcha, gotcha." So it just made an immediate wonderful impression of this really great personable company that we were a part of. So
Yeah.
so what are you most proud of? You have so many things on your list, and I'm curious, as you're going forward, what is your legacy that you're most proud of?
Hard to say. I think uh, there was a very famous Japanese painter named Sato.
Hmm.
And when he was in his 90s, the journalists who are very reverential towards their older people generally, more so than in the US, by the way. And uh, but to him in particular because of his fame, "Oh, Sato-san, what is your
Hmm.
most uh, well, the same question actually, different ways to look at it. Not what is your most famous, but what are you most proud of?"
Yes.
And his answer was, "I'm working on it."
Oh, I love
And
that.
and I prefer that approach.
Hmm.
Looking back, that's great, but that doesn't get you that much. You can look back to learn certain
Right.
things. That's
Right.
great. Say, "Well, I got that wrong," or maybe that person could do that thing today that couldn't have been done yesterday.
Well, the word that, I mean, it's one of my most favorite words. I love transformation. I love authenticity. I see you, and I've always seen you as an extremely authentic, core centered person. And when I look at the values that you had outlined, that's exactly, we're using different words, but we are talking the same language. And I'm just really, really honored that you were here with us today. Honestly, John, it's like you're just such an incredibly authentic person, And it's truly an honor to have had this conversation. And I do want to give a shout out to Lee Sullivan for connecting us. She's maintained a beautiful relationship with you over the years and allowed me to, elbow in a little bit and get some of your time. So
How many people came to the event, by the way, the reunion event?
right. I will say we had about 45 originally signed up. And because of various things from illness to birthday party to whatever, we were down to approximately 30 to 35, somewhere in that.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah. And it's, to me, when I tell people, because the first one we did was in Chicago, when I tell people came from around the world for a 3-hour happy hour in Chicago, their mouths just fall open. It's like, you don't understand. We loved each other. And it wasn't like we were best buddies because we only saw each other a few times a year, but it was the culture. It was the fun we had, but I think we were all driving toward, I don't know how you guys did it, but we were driving toward a mission that we weren't even necessarily benefiting from. But it was very clear, and we got to have fun along the way. We had an opportunity to be autonomous in our territories, make decisions, and yet, which is, if you think about Daniel Pink's book Drive, he talks about 3 elements that are very important in motivation, right? One is autonomy, one is mastery, the opportunity for mastery, and one is purpose. And I often see where one of those is missing with clients when they're leading.
Yes.
You weren't missing any of those. We had all 3 of those elements, now that I think of it. And so it's pretty cool. Pretty cool.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Anything else you want to say to anyone as far as advice or where they can find you, or if you want to be found or not found?
Well, stay curious. That's always one thing.
Yes.
And keep that sense of humor and adopt it, because humor is changing too. Sort of interesting. But create your own, tell stories, and pass it on. That's always great.
Terrific. Thank you so much, John Abele.
Bye-bye, Heidi.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. I just finished my conversation with John Abele. What a great man. Off camera, we had an interesting conversation afterward. And, one of the things that I ask for in clients, in myself, in my kids, is openness. I think that's the number one gateway or entry point into any kind of higher level thinking, and that's openness. Openness is healthy, and it takes into account diversity and different perspectives. And John is absolutely a very open person. I think he's a creative thinker too. And the creativity, I believe, comes from that balance of right, left brain perspective. But he had to walk through the door of openness in order to allow that creativity to foster into something so magical as Boston Scientific, which then that leads to my thoughts about authenticity. And I meant it when I said about the light that he has shining in him. If he wasn't that person who was open and curious and healthy in his own, core, operating from his core. We did talk about that after our recording. If he wasn't operating from his core, he would not have achieved the success and greatness that he's achieved. And I'm not talking about just financial. I'm talking about as a leader, as an innovator, as a respected man in less invasive medicine, as a business owner, as a, just in general, right? The other thing we talked about afterwards that I want to share with you is the book I wrote is called The Light Switch, and people assume that is about turning on your power. That's not the case. I assume your power is already turned on. It's about switching that power from the outside, which John referenced, that outside ego, pseudo leader power, to the inside core true power. Truly, that's where power resides. And when we were talking off camera, I mentioned, because I see that 4 light in him, I think that's what has led him to, again, the success that he's had. And then his last comment was, edit out some of that. And I said, well, what parts? And he says, the compliments. I'm like, I'm not editing out the compliments, because they're very much from my heart, my perspective, especially based on the work that I do. I see all those great qualities and aspects in him. So no, they're not getting edited out. So that's it. Hope you got something really special from this conversation. Thank you again, John Abele, and all the people that made that happen. And have a great rest of the day. Thanks. You have been listening to the Charging Up Leadership podcast, and I am your host, Heidi Fry, charged up, plugged in, and sending you energy, light, and love. Find me at HeidiFry.com. And don't forget to check out my book, The Light Switch, available on Amazon, in your local bookstores, or on my website. The Charging Up Leadership podcast is created, hosted, and produced by Heidi Fry. Theme music is by Yevchen Anoychenko from Pixabay.